Rip Rapson is the president and CEO of the Kresge Foundation, based here. And he has, since 2006, been busy expanding one of America's great philanthropic organizations, shifting the philosophy and shifting the way that they innovate, but also enable innovation. They've had a Detroit focus on arts and culture, on education, environment, on human services, community development, but they're seeing a much larger opportunity for both the foundation and for the lessons learned that you'll hear about here in Detroit. And we thought it would be good to start with the man who, you know, 15 years from now, 10 years from now, when the history of Detroit's Renaissance is written, and the transition that Detroit is going through, Rip will be one of those people in that movie. The movie version, he'll probably be played by, I don't know, somebody like a Robert Redford type who is quiet. You know, he's quietly making things happen, but we thought we'd get him up here to tell the story, not just of what's happening in Detroit, but the implications. This will be our background, Detroit, but it'll also be in the foreground of our discussions, I suspect. So the title of his presentation, Leading from Local Circumstances, Lessons from Detroit. Please join me in welcoming Rip Rapson.
Thank you, Gordon.
Redford, I really do think.
He's like 80 years old, right? Yeah, I think that
the younger version
seems only appropriate. So, good morning, everybody. I was told that this is called a pickle. What do you call this? A pickle switch. So I want to make sure the clicker is working. Just a second. There we go. Welcome to Detroit. It is just an enormous pleasure to have you here. We appreciate your making the trip. I want to talk this morning about Detroit's bankruptcy. And I want to leave you with three impressions at the end of all of this. First, that the bankruptcy is actually three activities rolled into one. There are three very distinct components. We tend to focus on long-term debt adjustment, but I'm going to talk about other components of the bankruptcy. Second, I want you to kind of walk away with the sense that the leadership structure in Detroit has been over these last couple of years and will on a go-forward basis be a much more distributive leadership structure that is less dominated by the municipal government and much more an inclusive embrace of the public, private, and nonprofit sectors working together. And three, I want you to have an impression of a city working at the sharp edge of innovation because its very survival depends on it. So let me walk you through the three pieces of the bankruptcy. When Governor Snyder appointed an emergency manager almost 18 months ago to take over the affairs of the city of Detroit, it was largely driven by the need to adjust the long-term debt of the city. And I'm not going to take you through a highly detailed technocratic explanation of the long-term debt structure of the city, but it is important because the kind of debt that we were looking at, the governor concluded, was simply unsustainable over time and simply not susceptible of being adjusted in the normal course. And the sacrifice, of course, was then enormous, substituting an emergency manager for the authorities and of the mayor and the city council. So there are three pieces of this that are all too familiar. Retiree health care, spiraling out of control as it is in most American cities. Underfunded pension obligations. We had an average police and fire pension of about $31,000. There was some likelihood that that could be cut by as much as $5,000, $10,000, $12,000. The average general retiree pension could have been cut from an average of $19,000 probably down to $10,000. Completely unacceptable cuts under any scenario in bankruptcy. And finally, there were the bondholders, and we'll talk more about this, but people who wanted to make claims against the city, who had various forms of security against the city, and the challenge was how to reconcile all of these things. But there was a second part of the bankruptcy that emerged over the course of has emerged over the course of the last year, which is the restructuring of municipal systems. At first, I think Kevin Orr, our emergency manager, really struggled with how to think about lighting and transit and police and fire and all of the basic structures of the city that were so difficult to get a handle on. When Mayor Duggan was elected in September and November of last year, he began immediately to go to work on this. And the kinds of issues that the city was facing were almost as severe as the kinds of issues that it was facing in terms of the long-term debt. First, there was the structural budget deficit. No matter how hard we tried, we could not get the books in balance. The revenues simply could not support the cost structure of the city. Again, something that Mayor Bing worked on for a very long time and just could not get it right, in part because there was a continuing decline in the tax base. It's very difficult to bring your books into balance when there is a constant erosion of your tax base. And finally, there was the sort of the inefficiency and ineffectiveness of public services. When your buses don't run on time, when you can't do police response in a reasonable time, when you can't collect your taxes, it's very difficult to think about how the government works in any kind of rational way. But you know, you can restructure your long-term debt, you can figure out how to rejigger city government, but at the end of the day, there is then the third component. And this is the one that really keeps our bankruptcy judge, who's currently in the middle of a bankruptcy hearing, up at night. And that is, how do you create long-term health for the city of Detroit? Because unless you build tax base, unless you hold out the potential for growth, unless you kind of create the kinds of amenity structures that over time are going to cause residents to stay and new residents to move in, of course, you've lost the game. And there, the challenge really falls squarely on all of the sectors to step up their game. You know, for a long time during the auto crisis in particular, the private sector was in a bunker. It was in a defensive crouch. We could not get any kind of active engagement out of the private sector. The markets really had failed Detroit. The public sector, obviously, over the long term, has to sort of reorient itself so the kinds of investments it makes day to day contribute to the long-term building blocks of an essential, sustainable city. And finally, philanthropy had to make sure that it was providing the kind of support it can to over time, build the kind of infrastructure that the city needed. So I'm going to go through warp speed each one of these because I think each one of them has a sort of a slightly different message to send, both about the nature of the philanthropic role, but also the nature of the sort of the civic roles and responsibilities that are playing out in Detroit. So first is the adjustment of long-term debt. Here is the scope of the debt, and without trying to add up all the numbers, let me just tell you that the debt was somewhere between 19 and 21 billion dollars, depending on how it is calculated. You know, I got a call almost just months after the bankruptcy started from a guy named Jerry Rosen. Judge Rosen is the chief judge of the Federal District Court in Southeast Michigan, and he had been appointed by Judge Rhodes to help mediate the claims that you see in this box, everything from how do you restructure health care to how you work through the creditor claims. And Judge Rosen explained to me that the problem with the bankruptcy, when all was said and done, was that there was the threat of two very different lawsuits that would bring the city ultimately to its knees because it would extend litigation out over a decade and would just be almost insurmountable. The first was the state of Michigan's constitutional protections of pensions. If you were to impair pensions in any way during the bankruptcy in ways that were unacceptable to the pension holders, the pension class, they would litigate this forever, and they would get into a huge fight about whether federal bankruptcy law or state constitutional law prevails in a dispute like this. But second, as all of the creditors were sort of lining up to figure out how they might be repaid, as you all have read and heard by now, they immediately looked to the sort of the easiest target they could find, which was the collection of art at the Detroit Institute of Art. And Judge Rosen explained to me that just as with the pension fight, you would have enormous fights over who owned the art. Was it held in public trust? Were the donor covenants violated or being honored by the fact that they were being stripped? And so he said the only solution he could figure out to resolve all of this was to create a pool of money that would help buffer the pensions from deep cuts and that would be sufficient to transfer ownership of the Detroit Art Institute's assets into a nonprofit that would be separate from the city. He called it the Art Trust. And I said, well, that's an interesting idea. How are you going to pay for it? And he said, well, that's why I asked you to dinner. And I should have left there. We would have, it's the most expensive dinner I ever attended. And I said, well, okay, that's fine. How much are you thinking? And he said, oh, I don't know, between $500 and $800 million. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, that's about what we're going to need in order to buffer the pensions, about what we'll need in order to pay due consideration for the art. So think about it, would you? And I said, okay, I'll think about it. And he said, Buzz, I'm going to get all of your colleagues in the room next week, and I'm going to put this idea to them. I couldn't come to that meeting, but Judge Rosen got them all in a room, about 12, 15 foundations who work in Detroit, and put this question to them, and he got about the same reaction he got from me, sort of, really? But it was a serious proposition, and it was a serious problem. So I got on the phone to my counterpart at the Ford Foundation, Darren Walker, and I said, Darren, there's only one way we're going to move this conversation, and that is as if both the Ford Foundation is the largest national funder and the Kresge Foundation, which sort of has a foot in both worlds, local and national, come up with big money. And we kind of looked at each other and said, well, what are we talking about? And we both concluded that we were talking probably in the neighborhood of $100 million apiece, above and beyond what we would normally spend in Detroit. So to make a very long story short, we were able to convince our boards to come up with $100 million apiece. In Darren's case, Ford actually came up with 125. Judge Rosen then walked that to the governor, who said, if philanthropy is going to be prepared to get that ball rolling, and by then we had gotten our other philanthropies in Detroit to come up with a huge amount of money. It ended up being almost $375 million. Then the state would be willing to come in at a similar level. They ended up passing a legislative package of almost $350 million. We then were able to convince the Institute of Art itself to come up with $100 million. We actually came up with a fund of about $850 million. We attached to that a bunch of conditions about the management of the pensions and how the governance of the DIA would be structured. But in effect, what we were able to do was exactly what Judge Rosen had suggested we needed to do, which was to hold the police and fire pensions at almost 100% of their expected pensions, and the general pensioners, everybody else, at about 96%. And we were able to essentially satisfy, I think, the relevant parties that this was sufficient to transfer the DIA's ownership into a nonprofit status and out of city status. All of this hasn't been done yet. It will depend on the bankruptcy. And in fact, what we then did was made sure that this was all sort of broadly consistent with the way Kevin Orr and Judge Rosen were negotiating all of these other complexities of the debt structure, or then put together what's called a plan of adjustment that put it all into a big package. He put that in front of the bankruptcy judge, let the creditors go at it. And tomorrow and Friday, the judge will probably hear the final testimony in that bankruptcy trial and issue his opinion probably later this month. We have every reason to believe that this so-called grand bargain will hold, and that the kinds of adjustments to the long-term obligations of the city will be successful. So that's the first component. Let me talk about the second, which is restructuring municipal services. As I mentioned, Mayor Duggan has really gone to work trying to figure out how to put in place a sweeping set of revisions to the way the city functions. You can see in this suite of 7 some of his leading priorities. I want to talk just about a couple of them and talk about how philanthropy and the private sector have joined with Mayor Duggan to do what is a very heavy lift. I think it's quite clear that the city itself simply cannot execute on all of these priorities and is going to need help from the other sectors. So let me start with promoting economic development. Now, part of the problem in Detroit is that it's been an automobile monoculture for the better part of 100 years. We simply have to diversify our economy. So about 6 or 7 years ago, the Kresge, Ford, and Kellogg Foundations each made $25 million investments into a fund that would become known as the New Economy Initiative. That fund would grow to almost $135 million. And it was intended to help diversify the economy of the city by promoting small business development, with a particular focus on entrepreneurial infrastructure. We have spent the last 5 or 6 years watching the enormous benefits of those investments. In Midtown, Corktown, all across the city, small businesses are beginning to pop up, whether it's Shinola or restaurants or commercial ventures or arts and cultural organizations, service organizations. The transformation of the city has been remarkable, and I would argue that it is at least in part because of the extraordinary early investment, which in many ways helped kind of get this ball rolling in a way that others could pick up. You heard from Matt Cullen last night at Quicken. Obviously, Dan Gilbert and the Quicken folks have done a huge amount of work on their end of the avenue, making a entrepreneurial ecology a reality, but I think you can't overstate the extent to which the New Economy Initiative really jump-started ecological changes in the small business environment. The second piece is public safety. This is, when all is said and done, largely a public sector responsibility, but Kresge has invested, for example, in something called Code 4, which is a program at Wayne State, which is really sort of a hotspot identification program that tries to not only identify where these hotspots of crime are, but sort of project forward and almost predict where crime will move. It has been an enormous resource to the department. Similarly, Kresge, together with 7 corporate donors, came up with about $8 million to provide 100 new emergency vehicles and police vehicles to the department to help bring them into the 21st century. Ameliorating blight is a huge problem. As you probably have heard by now, Detroit is home to about 80,000 vacant and blighted properties. If you aggregate that land mass, it's the size of the city of San Francisco, if you can imagine. About a year ago, Secretary Donovan, Secretary of HUD, issued a challenge to the city to try to figure out a roadmap for taking down all of those blighted properties, not just some of them, not sort of incrementally getting at them, but creating a roadmap for the whole tamale. And Dan Gilbert stepped forward, volunteered to head that task force together with a couple of folks from the community, and they have done something I think no city really has done. The genius has been that they dispatched 125 young people equipped with iPhones into the neighborhoods to inventory every single parcel in the city, all 388,000 of them, with an eye toward understanding what their conditions are. And that information was all beamed back to Command Central at Quicken Loan. And the platform that emerged with that information, coupled with tax information and water information and foreclosure information, has given us a base from which to make decisions about which properties need to be demolished, which properties can be rehabilitated, which can be deconstructed and recycled. It really provides a blueprint for moving forward on one of the most intractable issues of the city. The fourth example of where philanthropy and the private sector have helped with the municipal lift is in transit redesign. Mayor Duggan has spent a lot of time trying to get the bus system right. That's clearly essential. But getting a regional transportation system in place that connects the city to the burbs and the burbs to the city is just absolutely essential. And about 7 years ago, I had the opportunity to have lunch with Roger Penske, who's really our great corporate citizen here in town, to talk about what his next civic contribution might be. And I suggested to Roger that we desperately needed light rail to run along Woodward Avenue, which is the region's spinal cord. By doing that, I suggested that we might be able to not only connect all of the institutions up and down the line, but you begin creating the kind of regional transportation system that this community so desperately needs. It becomes sort of the down payment on a much larger system of bus rapid transit and high-speed rail into Ann Arbor and up to the northern job centers and the like. Roger took the suggestion seriously, and he subsequently convened a group of about 20 civic leaders to talk about its feasibility. Turns out it was feasible. The problem was the price tag. It was about $100 million. And so at that first meeting, Roger turned to me. I don't know why people do this, but I guess something about our endowment. Turned to me and said, "Rip, if Kresge would be willing to put in the first $35 million for this system, I'll do my best to make sure that we can raise the rest." You know, it was a crazy idea at some level. Foundations don't build light rail systems. Private sector doesn't build light rail systems. Municipal government does. But the audacity of the aspiration justified the risk, or so it seemed to me. So I agreed, and we moved forward. We created something called the M1 system, which essentially tried to create a connection between the river and Midtown, again with the hope that that would be the spinal cord first move for the larger system. And we, over the next 5 or 6 years, had to navigate almost inconceivable cascade of obstacles: bureaucratic resistance, engineering complexity, delays and cost overruns. But at the end of the day, we raised almost $175 million. We cleared out all of the bureaucratic and political underbrush, and we created what no city in America has ever created, which was a light rail system planned and predominantly financed by the philanthropic and private sectors. Those of you who are wandering around Detroit, if you get frustrated by the tear-up in the road, that is the M1 system. It'll carry its first riders in 2016. So it's one thing to clear out your long-term debt, which is extraordinary. It is another thing to begin restructuring your public services, which is essential. But at the end of the day, you simply have to build the kind of city that people want to stay in, want to invest in, and want to move to. Philanthropy over the last number of years has had to step forward when the private sector really was in no position to do so, and when the public sector had really fallen apart. I want to close just with a very brief description of 6 roles that I think philanthropy has played over the last number of years in creating kind of a scaffolding for the next stage of Detroit's renewal. And I think from that we can extrapolate that philanthropy can continue to play these roles on a go-forward basis. First is helping set long-term vision and broadening the civic alliance. I think the best example of how that plays out is something called the Detroit Future City Plan. This is a plan that took 4 years to birth, largely funded by Kresge, but with other partners. It was an attempt to try to figure out how we could reinforce nodes of strength in Detroit and convert underutilized land into more productive uses, whether that's urban farming, blue-green infrastructure, any number of different options. We brought in 8 superbly gifted technical teams from all across the world to help us think about all dimensions of the question: economic development, transit redesign, natural infrastructure reworking, all that sort of thing. And we coupled that with a robust community engagement process that touched almost 50,000 Detroiters. And the combination of the bottom-up, top-down process generated something called the Detroit Future City Plan, which really has become the investment and decision-making blueprint on a go-forward basis for how we're going to use land. So when you think about the Blight Task Force's work, those decisions about where to make your first moves, your 4th moves, your 15th moves in terms of building, demolition, and reclamation are all nested within this broader plan. It is a remarkable document that has really become, in many ways, the guidepost for public, private, and nonprofit sectors on a go-forward basis. The second way in which philanthropy is working is to contribute to the long-term civic talent base. Just a very quick example. We went down to New Orleans to try to understand how in post-Katrina they had sort of best organized their work. And one of the things we found was that the thing that we heard time and time again was that to help revivify the sort of the civic energy in a place, it was really helpful to create a cohort of young people who were working on the key issues of the time. And so we created something called the Detroit Neighborhood Revitalization Fellows, housed it in Wayne State. And these were essentially 30 mid to early career architects, planners, economic development specialists who could be placed in key city institutions and really help sort of accelerate the energy of reform that was already at work in those places. We issued a call, got 600 or 700 applicants for 30 positions, chose 10 from Detroit, 10 folks who had been from Detroit and who wanted to move back, and 10 who had no connections. It was a remarkable cohort. They stayed for 2 years, and what's so remarkable is I think except 28 of the 30 have stayed in Detroit and have continued to make their lives here. And we're now in our second cohort. Well, 30, 60 people won't change the trajectory of a city, but when you couple that with White House Fellows, German Marshall Fellows, and other kinds of leadership programs, you begin sort of churning the civic energy base that is so essential to changing the long-term trajectory of the city. Third, this is, I think, a classic philanthropic function, which is to provide high-risk, early-stage capital where the market simply won't. In many ways, the New Economy Initiative is an example of this, trying to create the small business entrepreneurial ecology that you need in order to jumpstart the work. But let me just mention one other simple example, which is the Woodward Corridor Investment Fund. This is a $30 million fund in which Kresge essentially took the first highest risk dollars and put them on the table. And by doing that, was able to entice both MetLife, Prudential, and a number of other lenders who would otherwise not lend into Detroit to come to the table and make high-risk loans. For them, it wasn't high risk. For us, it's high risk. And what this has done is to essentially accelerate the development pipeline along Woodward Corridor. And Sue Mosey, who runs Midtown Inc., has this enormously exciting pipeline of potential projects. She has to go to 15, 16 different fund sources to draw those down. It's going to take forever. This is a sort of a one-stop shop that provides much easier, more accessible capital that can really be an accelerant to the way we go about revitalizing the city. Fourth is philanthropy has served as a guarantor of value for private markets. We don't always have to invest in individual transactions. You can also invest in the public infrastructure. So whether it's the M1 rail system or whether it's the $50 million investment that Kresge made almost a decade ago in the Riverwalk, these are the kinds of amenity structures that private markets look to as they think about whether they're going to locate here, whether they're going to invest here, whether they're going to encourage their people to stay here. Dan Gilbert told me not so long ago that he simply would not have moved his employees into downtown Detroit if there hadn't been the investment in the Riverwalk and hadn't been the investment in the M1 system. These are the kinds of things that the private markets need as signals in order to get back into the game. Fifth, philanthropy can function as a seller. By this I mean that there are times when a philanthropy like Kresge that both knows the local circumstance and sort of has a national network can go out and make the case that people ought to come here. Just one example. About a year ago, right after the bankruptcy was announced, Gene Sperling, the president's economic advisor, called me and he said, you know, the president would really like to be helpful to Detroit during the bankruptcy, but we can't get appropriations through the Congress. We can't forgive your bonds. We can't, we have to figure out ways that we can take existing federal programs and make them work better for the city. Can you help me figure out how to do that? So I asked Laura Trudeau, who's sitting in the middle of the room, to sort of take on that task. She assembled a group of people who essentially did a white paper for Gene, sort of outlining in housing, in transit, in public safety, and technology upgrade, the kinds of federal programs that we believed might be useful in helping the city get traction coming out of the bankruptcy. Gene liked the paper. He asked a handful of us to come out to Washington. We spent the better part of 3 or 4 hours with about 12 cabinet officials, including 6 or 7 secretaries, going through every piece of Laura's work. They liked it a lot. They took it back, pushed it into their systems, and within a month or two, Gene came back with a bunch of cabinet secretaries to Detroit and announced a $300 million package in which federal dollars had been reallocated from one division to another, that certain things had been fast-forwarded, other regulatory issues had been clarified. It was a remarkable example, it seems to me, of the federal government working with a sort of a local Sherpa who could sort of ground truth the kind of issues that the federal government was struggling with and really end up investing in a significant way in the future of the city. And finally, and I think this is often easy to overlook when philanthropy tries to be strategic and forward-looking and aggressive, Philanthropy really can be an important steward of fragile economies. The market at the end of the day is simply not going to invest in the human services infrastructure that involves frontline social services. It's at the end of the day not going to invest in the fragility in improving the fragility of an arts ecology, arts organizations, individual artists, or the infrastructure that supports them. It's probably not going to invest in the sort of the burgeoning and yet nascent food system that we're seeing in Detroit with Eastern Market and urban gardening and all of the rest. Philanthropy simply has to step up and understand that over the long term, this is an important philanthropic role. You just have to protect those fragile ecologies. So when you think about Detroit, think about the long-term adjustment of the debt. Extraordinarily important. We will have done what very few cities in America are able to do on that score at the end of the bankruptcy. Think about the, I think, enormous energy that's being dedicated into the restructuring of municipal services, and think about how philanthropy can ultimately join with its civic partners to create the kind of broad-based building blocks for civic renewal. Because I think at the end of the day, when those things combine, and that ultimately will be the legacy of this bankruptcy, you will have a city that I think is poised to resume its role as a great American city. So stay tuned. I think a very different Detroit is beginning to emerge. And thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Rip. Thank you.